Hello, and welcome back to another bonus episode of Season 5. This is our interview with Vu Minh Hoang, a faculty member in History and Vietnam Studies at Fulbright University, Vietnam, and also a fellow at the Weatherford East Asian Institute at Columbia. In this interview, Noah and Vu Minh Hoang discuss the war between the Khmer Rouge and Vietnam, and the war between China and Vietnam that quickly followed after Deng Xiaoping decided to punish the Vietnamese and, quote-unquote, teach them a lesson. Enjoy.
So the first question we wanted to ask was, what signs were there during the collaboration of the Vietnamese and Cambodian communists that things would take a turn once their common enemies were defeated?
There were lots of signs, and sometimes the signs are there and like right in front of our eyes, and they don't really notice it, right? And sometimes they do notice. So the first sign is that Pol Pot, Insari, that group of Khmer revolutionaries had always spoken about their distrust of Vietnam. Many of them had spent some significant amounts of time in Hanoi, interestingly, during the war. They would have been around the diplomatic compound at 195 Dot Cân, which still today is, so my parents actually live, they have an apartment right on the street front, but behind in those alleys, today there are sort of retirement homes for Vietnamese politicians, bureaucrats. So around that area, they would have been provided some housing by the Vietnamese government during the war years. And I have it on good authority from several diplomats who looked at these recordings that, in fact, there were some hidden microphones in these apartments, which is very standard, Eastern Bloc practice. I think people who've seen films like what's that East German one?
It's funny you bring up The Lives of Others, because Brendan and I are pretty known haters of that movie.
Oh yeah, no. So there's a lot about it that's problematic, but then there's also like a lot of its portrayal of wiretapping and why is it the wall? Like that's pretty accurate. That's pretty accurate. The Vietnamese had some idea of some of the plans, but sometimes it's like you're not exactly sure whether it's just shop talk, whether it's just the boys hanging out and they say these sorts of things, or whether they actually do mean to carry out emptying out the cities and returning the country to year zero when they actually seize power, right? Like I think to some extent they understood that this was the sort of thing that was said, but they're not. The Vietnamese were not sure whether it would actually be carried out. The other really big sign was that in the early 70s, when they were still fighting together against the Lon Nol government, there were a number of Cambodians, ethnic Cambodians, who were what they call Khmer Krom. So they're Cambodians who were born in the Delta or elsewhere in the southern Vietnamese space.
Right, for our listeners, ethnic Khmer nationalists call South Vietnam Kampuchea Krom.
Right.
It's a sort of designation describing the ethnic geographic and ethnic character of the people in the Mekong Delta and South Vietnam, Cambodian sort of general area.
Right, and it's for these people, essentially it's a bit like the American Southwest, right? So the border crossed them. The Vietnamese state, the Vietnamese empire had expanded into these areas that were once Khmer, and so they exist as sort of both Vietnamese and Khmer's, and many of them followed the communist revolution. The Delta in the south was actually a hotbed of communist activity, and many of them were sent by the Vietnamese communists to join the Cambodian comrades in the fight. And there were also other Cambodian communists who were closer to the Vietnamese as well, who were like from Cambodia, right? But they had joined the Viet Minh early, like in the 40s, 50s, and so what they start to notice is in the 60s and especially in the early 70s, that even though the Khmer Rouge were fighting together with the Vietnamese communists against the Lon Nol government, against the Americans, against the South Vietnamese government, they were also starting to do these purges of officials that were close to Vietnam. And it would just be like summary executions, accusations of betrayal, of being CIA planned, disloyalty, and it's a pattern, right? Of course, they don't kill everyone, but it
and how aware were the Vietnamese communists of that this was going on?
I mean, they're aware because they're people, right? But this is something that, I mean, it happens, and it happens in a lot of movements. So let's say if you look at Kim Il-sung in North Korea, right? He, in this one fell swoop in the mid-1950s, got rid of both the pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese North Koreans in his government, right? That this sort of thing happens also in various Eastern European countries as well. So the Vietnamese are aware, but again, I think just from a historian's perspective, we have the benefit of hindsight 2020, and we can sort of know how everything turned out. At the time, they were aware of some of these trends and some of these movements, but it was less clear to them whether it would all turn out that way, right? Of course, you can see a trend, but you're not exactly sure.
Yeah, and to that point, one of the ways that these tensions manifested was with the border disputes between Vietnam and Cambodia that cropped up almost immediately after both the Cambodian and Khmer Rouge victory in Cambodia in 75, as well as the final Vietnamese victory and the unification of the country that also happened in 75. So as they're both, essentially from the perspective of their movements, like achieving national liberation, there's also fighting between these two countries. Why was that? And was there something to do with it that, ties to their status as both former French colonies?
Yeah, so this is connected to something I alluded to earlier. I mean, the real roots of it all was the Vietnamese conquest of southern Vietnam, right? So the cradle of the Vietnamese civilization is the Red River Delta. That's in northern Vietnam, where Hanoi is today. And it's only, so up until like the 1400s, the Vietnamese had only expanded up to the the central part of the country. And up until that time, they had a series of wars with the Chams. So there was a Cham Empire, which is ethnic Austronesian, the Austronesian-speaking people. So their language and culture would be closer to the Malays, Indonesians, right? The island Southeast Asians. And then below them, in further south, were the Khmers, who occupied the Delta today. And there was really around early 1500s, there was this one Vietnamese king, Lê Thánh Tông, who for most of the wars before that, the Vietnamese actually lost to the Cham. But Lê Thánh Tông decisively defeated the Cham and expanded the empire southward. Another thing that really led to that was this internal division in the Lê dynasty, where it was ruled by different lords, the Trịnh in the north and the Nguyen, who fled from the Trịnh to the south. And the Nguyen lords continued pushing this border down south and eventually became emperors themselves. This is a very, very quick recap of that history. And as they're moving down south, they adopt many of the colonialist Chinese attitudes that the Chinese had foisted upon them. So they saw themselves as the standard bearers of civilization, defined as the Sinosphere, defined as the sort of cynic Confucian space. Right? They would be the ones to civilize the South and colonize it. They call it Khai Hoang, which is very similar to how American settlers, European settlers, I should say, in North America, right, settler colonials would call it, like rehabilitating the wild land and making it arable, making it productive, and that's what they really saw the Chams and the Khmers as essentially barbarians and people to be civilized, people to be educated. And so they moved into this space over the couple hundred years, and the Cambodian nation itself was very close to the kingdom, was split as a mutual protectorate of Siam in the west and Vietnam in the east by the early 1800s, so under the reign of Emperor Minh Mac. And that was, so shortly after Minh Mac died, and Minh Mac in particular was a very tough emperor. He had treated the Khmers very badly. He had taken away many of the autonomy that his father, Zalong, had granted them. So the Khmers have a very, very negative memory of this period of Vietnamese domination. And the French came in just in time, more or less, to save the Cambodian kingdom from being wiped off the map completely. And Champa is no longer on the map, right? Champa is gone. But Cambodia still exists, and the Cambodians are a little bit grateful for that, but they're also not grateful for the fact that the French, even though they saved this country on the map, the way that they colonized Cambodia was by bringing in, because the French were always a very small group of administrators, right? European colonialism in Asia and Africa, except for South Africa, or Southern Africa, was not as settler colonial as in the Americas or Australia. So they relied a lot on local administrators, and in fact, the French shipped in more Vietnamese than ever before to help them colonize the space. So that's and that breeds further resentment, right, with the Cambodians who are native to this area. So that's sort of a very quick recap of that history. And so the Cambodians have always, because a lot of these socialist communist movements in Southeast Asia, they're not purely socialists, right? They are also very nationalist. They're not really just this internationalism. They really believe in reviving these colonial these countries that have had to suffer through colonialism. So Cambodia, the Cambodian communists, other than wanting to throw off French colonialism and American imperialism, they also eventually wanted to throw off Vietnamese colonialism as well. And they had irredentist ideas about the southern part of Vietnam.
Well, so let's just to unpack that slightly. When you say irredentist, meaning there were internationally agreed upon borders of like demarcated that both countries theoretically subscribed to, but that there were ambitions from the Cambodian side to change those borders without the formal pretext of war or diplomatic engagement. There was just lower to escalating levels of violence that just began to take place. What was it about? Was there a real aspiration for the Cambodians to, because this was it began small, and this leads to our next question. It began small, but then it grew over time in the second half of the 70s. Why did this pattern of violence toward Vietnam grow in that time? Sort of leading up, sort of up to the period, let's say, because even when Vietnam does make the decision to invade Cambodia, that comes after, that is after a long period of both violence and kind of diplomatic confusion about what's going on.
Yeah. So I would say there's definitely the peak of violence towards the ethnic Vietnamese was certainly the Khmer Rouge period, right? The period immediately preceding the Vietnamese invasion and leading to the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia. But I would not say that it is a unique phenomenon or that it's that recent. I can count at least 4 major pogroms of the Vietnamese in Cambodia. So the first one really broke out, massive communal violence. Broke out not just in Cambodian territory, but also on sort of Vietnamese territory in the Delta, directly after after World War II, and during the first years of what we call the War of Independence. Sean McHale just wrote a great book about this, The Fracturing of the South. Sean McHale, professor, friend of mine at George Washington University. I really recommend you check out that book. It's and he talked about a very similar image to what was happening in the 1970s, which is just people in the downstream of the Mekong River in Vietnam could see just dead bodies floating down the river, dead Vietnamese bodies, right? Massive communal violence, like reprisals against the Vietnamese. Who you have to understand that the many of these ethnic Khmers in Cambodia and some even in Vietnam too, really thought of them as colonialists twice over. Right, the colonialists in taking Cambodian territory first, and then they were colonialists in helping the French take it. So this happened in the 40s, and then it happened again. Well, not that level of violence, but certainly displacement and pushing out the Vietnamese under the Sihanouk government. So the first independent Cambodian government also persecuted the Vietnamese, and then it intensified a lot more during the Lon Nol period. So the military dictatorship that was installed in 1970 via a coup that was supported by the United States. Again, each time, and then of course leading to the Khmer Rouge time, each time the best explanation really is just this reaction in a way to what they considered colonialist, and the tenor of it, the intensity of it. I would say we can best understand it actually through something that's in the news today, which is the war in Gaza. Many people ask, like, how is it possible that an Israeli state that includes many people who've been persecuted for hundreds of years, who have suffered so much violence and genocide, how are they able to sort of turn around and do such terrible things to their neighbors? And I'd say that actually, of course they can. And in fact, it increases the chance that they would do so, because the Cambodians, like the Israelis today, to some extent, like the Hutus in Rwanda and other examples like that, it's their own experience of genocide, of feeling so threatened with destruction, that makes it politically very easy for certain leaders to convince them that violence is the only option. That you have to defend yourself. You have to sort of get rid of these colonialists and these outsiders. Another thing that really made the Khmer Rouge period even more intense was that, in part, the Khmer Rouge blamed many of their early failures and difficulties on outside agitators or spies or saboteurs. And of course, they blame it on the Vietnamese. So and of course on intellectuals and other people. So these people were accused of working both for the CIA and the Vietnamese at the same time.
Well, there was also, this was like the relationship or suspected relationship of Cambodian communists to Vietnamese was the basis. It was often the basis for a lot of the purges that came to, the successive purges that came to characterize the political culture of the Khmer Rouge.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like Pol Pot in particular and his clique, sort of how they consolidated control over the government and apparatus. You know, they were always in charge of the party, but the way that they consolidated it during the time of the government was through these purges. We've talked about how like Vietnam was, somewhat aware of that this was going on, but didn't see it as like, directionally necessarily getting worse. At what point, when you start getting into, a few years into the life of the Khmer Rouge, there begin to be, massacres committed by Khmer Rouge militants sent into sent into Vietnam. Brandon and I actually, when we were in Vietnam, we went to a village that had been the site of such a massacre.
Yeah, so there was An Giang, there was Tây Ninh. Those were the border areas that were most hit. But they basically attacked all along that border. My great uncle was killed in that war. He was stationed on that border essentially, and so the Khmer Rouge had actually started attacking just a few days, like within a week of the so-called liberation of Phnom Penh, which is in mid-April. And because the Vietnamese communists only took Saigon on 30th April, but the Khmer Rouge had succeeded with Phnom Penh about 2 weeks before. And in fact, they immediately attacked several disputed islands in South China Sea. It's sort of like the border between the South China Sea and the Gulf of Thailand. And one particular island, a very large one, which the Vietnamese call Phu Quoc, and I think the Cambodians, what do they call it? It's a core something. I'll have to, it slips my mind for now. That island is particularly contentious because it's much closer to Cambodian territory than Vietnamese territory. And the French had essentially drawn a line in the 1930s called the Brevy Line, which finally put that island in Vietnamese control. It's a bit like the situation of Crimea, if you will, of that switch in 1950. And they make this line essentially extend all the way into sort of Cambodian waters and then wrap closely around the island and back. So this is the sort of thing, because for the French it didn't really matter, right? It's all internal.
It was about like whatever was best for administering the French system at that time. Who gives a shit what it'll be like 50, 100 years later? Well,
the French didn't think they'd lose this territory, right? Or that it would be decolonized in such a way, right? It was all into China. Stalin only thought the Soviet Union would get bigger. He'd never imagined Ukraine and Russia one day having to split up whatever Crimea is. So it's that sort of situation. So they attacked these places, and the Vietnamese drove them back. Of course, the Khmer Rouge don't have a very powerful military, but it was a tense situation. The General Secretary of the Vietnamese Communist Party, Lê Duẩn, actually made his own trip to Phnom Penh to sort things out. And in that meeting, they figured the Khmer Rouge leaders said that we just had bad maps. Those guys didn't know where they were going. They were lost. Let's just let bygones be bygones. Let's just keep things as they are. So things were all right for about 2 years, and then
that's kind of. Should that be interpreted as like from the Khmer Rouge perspective, they were kind of doing a balancing act. Like they were clearly amped up, and there was kind of throughout the character of the regime and even, what they encouraged in the civic life of the people was a kind of anti-Vietnamese chauvinism. And then also, clear, as you just sort of described in this instance, when push came to shove, they weren't yet really prepared to like fight a war with Vietnam over like an island equivalent, like an island that the French had drawn up.
Yeah, I think at the time they had other priorities, right? They had this was like in the second half of, or really the middle of 1975. So they just gotten control of Phnom Penh and the other major cities, and they were emptying them out. They had a lot more to figure out at that point. And also at that point, they weren't really sure about the position of China and other states that and about their support. So things would be a lot different in 1977. So April 1977, on the anniversary of the what the Vietnamese call the liberation, right, of Saigon. Then they made their main attacks into these southwestern provinces that you saw, and these continued escalating through the summer, through September. The Vietnamese appealed to the Chinese for mediation. The Chinese were not very helpful, and eventually it led to a Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, basically pushing back the Khmer Rouge to within 30 kilometers of Phnom Penh in late 1977. And at this point, the Vietnamese military stopped, turned around, and camped close to the border, hoping that would be the end of it. But clearly it wasn't.
So as in 77, Vietnam, sends, this kind of like, like a big warning shot, essentially. They send armies down the highway. They get within a certain distance of Phnom Penh, and then they circle back. But then, basically a year later, Vietnam makes the decision to invade. What are the events kind of in the year leading up to its decision to invade that happen that sort of move the needle? Up to the point that they invade. Obviously, there are the massacres that we discussed. What were those killings? What was the context of them? And what was, what were the other factors?
Yeah. So first and foremost, the Khmer Rouge continued attacking. Right, like they were not letting off. And the Vietnamese found that even though they were establishing a military presence on that border, which is not what they wanted to do, because in fact the military had been demobilized after 1975, and they now had to pull young men away from productive economic tasks, and it's costly even to man that border, and they were suffering losses. So that's the first thing, is the military side were seeing further massacres. They were seeing that the border was porous, that they couldn't quite contain the threat as they thought they could. The second thing was that the Vietnamese were still holding out for Chinese mediation. Really, they understood that the Khmer Rouge wouldn't really listen to anyone. They don't really have relationships with any country except China. And the thing that really broke everything down was that Sino-Vietnamese relations broke down basically between the end of 1977 and the middle of 1978. So by June, July 1978, China had cut off all aid to Vietnam. And this is a more complicated question of why that happened. There were a number of different things at play. First, and probably most important, was that China was feeling a lot of threat from the Soviet Union at this time. Sino-Soviet split had been since a reality since the 1960s, but it's really intensified at this point. And after rapprochement with Nixon Kissinger with the United States, 1972-73, China, especially under Deng Xiaoping, the new leader who takes over and starts to consolidate power in 1977-78, really wished to put China in the American camp, really wanted to score points essentially with the United States, and build this alliance against the Soviet Union. And he saw the Vietnamese as being essentially a pawn of the Soviets. Both the Soviets and Chinese had pushed the Vietnamese to choose which way to go, and the Vietnamese didn't want to do so. But basically, they both Vietnam was in a position where it likely wouldn't get any aid at all from either power if it didn't choose. They were both pushing very hard, and Vietnam eventually did go with joining the Soviet-led Council for Mutual Economic Aid, CMEA, or sometimes called Comecon. The other really big issue at this time that got the Chinese very upset. There were border negotiations between China and Vietnam that broke down in early 1978. There were 3 rounds of negotiations, but so that contributes to things. But really, the other big thing that made the news was the Vietnamese socialization of the South, which the Vietnamese considered to be just a natural thing that they were always going to do after so-called liberating Saigon from the capitalists. Right? I mean, that's what they were fighting that war for. They were not fighting that war to maintain.
There was some Chinese expectation that South Vietnam would remain capitalist?
Not so much, but the Chinese were miffed about how. So basically, by socializing the South, what the Vietnamese did was take away, nationalize a lot of the properties, about 30,000 private businesses in Ho Chi Minh City. And most of those businesses actually belong to ethnic Chinese people. Because as you know, so throughout Southeast Asia, the Chinese are sometimes called the Jews of
exactly.
Asia.
Yes, they're like a kind of merchant class, connected, across different countries, in East Asia, Southeast Asia. Yeah, I'm familiar with that. Yeah.
And historically, they've also been the target of a lot of persecution and pogroms as well. So, and they also have very, very haunting memories of such persecutions in Batavia in the 1600s, in Manila. I think Batavia was twice, right? So, every 40 to 60 years during the colonial period, the natives, with the blessing of the colonial administrators, would just go on rampage and kill the local Chinese merchant population, right? And so this is also part of the reason why Singapore became independent from Malaysia, right? Because of these ethnic tensions and conflicts. It's tensions that would boil over in the 1960s, in 1965, 66, in the so-called anti-communist killings in Indonesia, but in fact, many of them were just targeting ethnic Chinese, right? So basically, the Chinese, really, really similar to the Cambodian situation, to the Israeli situation, Hutu situation. It's a population that's been persecuted in the past, that's extremely sensitive to these sorts of moves, nationalizing their businesses, introducing a new unified currency that wiped out the savings, which mainly affected the merchant class. And many of them started to leave from the south and in the north. The Chinese in northern Vietnam and Chinese in southern Vietnam left for somewhat different reasons and to somewhat different destinations. It's very complicated, but
so through this late 70s and into 78, when essentially there becomes like a pretty formal Chinese Vietnamese rupture. A lot of what's going on is the Sino-Soviet split tensions, the sort of specific way that Chinese people in the South were affected by the nationalization of everything. And I guess, the Cambodia probably in the grand scheme of things didn't mean a lot to China, but, Cambodia was China's client to a point. Yeah. With the Khmer Rouge, it's more complicated than that, I know. But there were, essentially it just seems like the stars were aligning particularly because of the Sino-Soviet dimension, for Vietnam and China to be opposed precisely at the moment when Vietnam needed China to rein in Cambodia, which then leads to, a two-front conflict the following year.
Yeah, exactly. And to be honest, the Chinese were not really egging the Khmer Rouge on to attack Vietnam. Right?
No.
No, the Vietnamese really suspect this. The Vietnamese, even today, right, and definitely the 1980s, they always accuse the Chinese of being behind the Khmer Rouge attacks and genocide and all of that stuff, and essentially accusing the Chinese of masterminding the destruction of the Cambodian people. And the truth, the kernel of truth, is that China was supporting the Khmer Rouge. It was doing so not because it liked the Khmer Rouge or supported its policies. In fact, Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese paramount leader at the time,
slow down.
Well, yeah, he had come to power getting rid of the Gang of Four, getting rid of the radicals in China, right, of the Cultural Revolution in China. So when he came to power, the Khmer Rouge press just attacked him, just went wild for like a week on what this terrible right-wing revisionist, what's he doing back here? Why is he in the coal mine? I thought he was in the coal mines.
Why isn't he in the coal mines?
So I mean, they were just very upset at him. And it's not a positive relationship. They're not aligned politically, ideologically. But you said Cambodia is not that important to the Chinese. Yes and no, right? I mean, China at this time didn't have many friends. I mean, it was really trying to reach out to the non-aligned movement, but it had made some serious missteps. I mean, Chinese Sino-Indian friendship had been one of the big bases for the setting up of the non-aligned movement and all that. And then the Chinese turned around in 1962 and give India a slap, and the Indians were absolutely shocked.
And so they were in a more reparative mood when it came to the democratic Kampuchea, as it was then called.
They were isolated. They were really isolated because a lot of third world countries had followed the Soviet Union, had good relations with the Soviet Union. The Chinese were pretty popular among a couple groups, like Shining Path in Peru, who were not in government. Some really far left, crazy revolutionaries in some of these places. They were very popular in France, where Rouge leaders studied, right, and in Western European countries, they were not doing that well in the third world. They really had Albania and Cambodia as allies with whom, and Romania to some extent.
So how did, back to the Vietnamese-Cambodian War, how did that, who attacked first, essentially? How did that actually start? And then what was the nature of the war itself? Was it short? Was it intense? Did the Khmer Rouge immediately fold? It was, Vietnam was pretty battle-tested. How did it go? How did it start?
Well, as I keep saying, it starts technically in the 1500s, right, from the Khmer Rouge perspective. But really, the war never. I mean, it stopped after that talk with Le Duc and Pol Pot in 1975. But once it restarted in April 1977, it never really stopped, right? I mean, there was always conflict. There wasn't even a ceasefire that was ever signed. So essentially, the Vietnamese decision to then actually push to Phnom Penh was more of a military operational decision, continuing a conflict that had, in fact, been raging for several years before that. And they decided to do so, in part because they were very worried about a two-front war, about coordination between China and the Khmer Rouge. They understood more or less that China was likely to attack Vietnam, that essentially the Chinese invasion in early 1979, in February, March, wasn't so much retribution for Cambodia, but it was something that the Vietnamese expected would always happen.
Before we get to the Chinese invasion, what happened when, because the Vietnamese presumably got to Phnom Penh pretty quickly. What happened to the Khmer Rouge?
In about 3 weeks, yes. So before they did that, they signed this treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union that guaranteed that the Soviet Union would come to the aid of Vietnam, or they Article 6 says they need to mutually consult if one of them is attacked. So Vietnam does that in November 1978, and then on Christmas Day 1978, makes the final general push for Phnom Penh, and that took about 3 weeks. So by the 7th of January 1979, they were in Phnom Penh. The Khmer Rouge, Vietnam was one of the most powerful militaries in the world at this time. It's battle tested through 30 years. It's got Soviet weapons, Chinese weapons, and American weapons. You name it, they have it. Mechanized, air power, everything. So they swept through very, very quickly and easily. The Khmer Rouge didn't really try to resist a frontal attack. That's not their style. They've never been a proper regular force. They were always a guerrilla force. That's where they feel most comfortable. That's just how they were trained. And they very happily ceded territory, in fact, to the advancing Vietnamese and emerged into the jungle. Many of them so-called surrendered, right? And of course were then quickly released. The main force retreated to the western side of the country along the Thai border. And many of them entered the territory of Thailand and set up camps along that border, believing the Vietnamese would not be attacking. And of course, from these camps, they would, over the next 10 years, continue to attack into Cambodian territory.
So before we get to kind of the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia and the sort of subsequent period, and what Vietnam saw about life and saw in Cambodia that changed their war aims, as we just talked about, China then declared war on Vietnam, some months into what was, at this point, like a prolonged Cambodian operation. An invasion turned into an occupation that would last many years. And so, Vietnam, having just signed this agreement with the Soviet Union, what then was this conflict with China? Clearly, it was not existential, but there was, or it didn't in the end. But like, how did it come about, and sort of what were the particular intrigues of it? And as you alluded to, how much was it really about what Vietnam was doing in Cambodia?
Yeah, so China was already very unhappy with Vietnam. Deng Xiaoping specifically has a visceral hatred for the Vietnamese. If you look at his interviews, if you look at the way that he talks about the Vietnamese, he uses words like ungrateful. He uses words like teaching them a lesson, right? That they need to know their place, things like that, right? So. And the Chinese certainly hoped that this war would endear themselves to the Americans. So Deng Xiaoping had brought with him, he was always going to visit Washington, D.C., and then make a trip through the United States in January 1979, because the two sides had agreed on a historic normalization of relations. That also means that the U.S. cuts off normal relations with Taiwan, or formal diplomatic recognition of Taiwan. Right? So it was supposed to be a big celebration in Washington, D.C. After the parties and galas, Deng Xiaoping told President Jimmy Carter, hey, I need a private meeting after this. It's very important. Only bring their closest circle, people that you really trust. And they had that meeting in the White House later that night, and Carter said, "What's so important?" And these, by the way, these records have been published as part of the Foreign Relations of the United States series, right? So the records of meetings are very clear, and Deng Xiaoping presented him with the specific plans for a punitive invasion of Vietnam that would last exactly a month. Right? So the Chinese it was very well planned. It was very specifically planned, and they were always going to retreat. It was always just going to be a limited operation. He promised that to Carter. Carter said, "This is shocking. I need a day to respond. Give me a day." He came back the next day with a long list of reasons why China shouldn't invade Vietnam. The Vietnamese also used to think that the Americans had told the Chinese to invade Vietnam. It's not true. But
so the Chinese really sought to do it for their own reasons. What was what was Deng's idea of what did he spell out as the fruits of what did victory look like to him, and what was the basis for doing this? Teaching Vietnam a lesson it's a little Nixonian. But could you tease out some of the logic?
Yeah, so he never put out his war aims that specifically, right? Of course, the hope to some extent is that the Vietnamese would withdraw from Cambodia, or it would buy the Khmer Rouge time. The Khmer Rouge didn't really need time bought. I mean, they were very comfortable and happy to go back to guerrilla fighting. They were not particularly able and good administrators. They were much better, or much more comfortable, I should say, not better, but much more comfortable outside than in. And I don't think that Deng, being the realist he is, and knowing the scope of the operation, I'm sure he didn't really believe that the Vietnamese would, in a sense, just suddenly realize the depths of their mistake and withdraw from Cambodia. And,
so what was the consequence? What was the consequence of the Chinese decision to come in?
So my understanding actually, this is something that confused me for a long time. But Jiang Xiaoming, who is one of the few scholars who really looked at Chinese documents and have thought about this from the Chinese perspective for a long time. We've had long discussions. He's written some great books. Deng Xiaoping's War is the name of his main book on this topic. The ironic thing is that Deng was doing it for the United States. The United States didn't ask for it, but he did it for the United States in the sense that he believed this is what the United States needs. This is the sort of thing that would get the Americans woken up to the threats of the Vietnamese and the Soviet Union, and they would eventually be happy with him. And so it's a very convoluted way of thinking. It's almost illogical, but in some ways it worked, right?
Well, so and also it wasn't the only thing Deng was doing to send that kind of message. Deng's China was participating in the arming of the Mujahideen, as listeners of this show, who listened to our last season will know. It's convoluted. It makes a certain amount of sense, but it's also it's very staged. It's not like the war aims then of what he sought to accomplish then, what did he, what was the actual toll incurred on Vietnam and Cambodians? Were mechanized divisions actually sent in for anything? Was it just bombings, etc.?
Oh, well, so in terms of death toll, it's a bit unclear, right? Because both sides put out very exaggerated tolls of the other side's death toll, and then they sort of hide their own. So I've seen a lot of different estimates. I don't think any of them are very accurate, but the numbers out there range from about 20 to 70,000 total casualties, right? With about a fifth or a sixth of those being deaths for a 1 month war. Now,
that's directly as a result of the Chinese attack.
Yeah, and the Chinese suffered probably slightly lower casualties than the Vietnamese, but also in the tens of thousands. Because you're looking at a land war in Asia. Yeah, who's that guy who says do not fight a land war in Asia? 600,000 Chinese troops coming down at you through the border. You might sort of know that, through your sources, through spy networks, whatever. that this would only be a 1 month punitive expedition thing. But guess what? When 600,000 Chinese are coming down at you with tanks, with planes, with the full might of the PLA, you're going to. I mean, it's something. It's something to see. The Vietnamese essentially put their military. They did engage, right? They understood this was supposed to be a limited operation. They understood the Chinese wanted to destroy some stuff, so they kept the main force. They did have to withdraw one division, I think 1 or 2 divisions from Cambodia, but again, that hardly matters, to the defense of Hanoi. So they put all the forces around Hanoi. This is also historically what the Vietnamese always did with historical Chinese invasions, stretching back a couple hundred years.
Like in the same way that like there's the classical strategy of like fleeing to the mountains, and like right. There's so, like
that happens after. If they lose that battle,
well, that's step 2. Step 1, if you don't get to step 2, is you gotta defend the capital.
Right. Step 1, they do try to defend the capital along this river that runs north of Hanoi, and about half the time they make it, the other half the time they lose, and then they take to the mountains. So in this case, that's where they put all their troop concentrations. Essentially, the Chinese most of the troops that were lost. And captured to the Chinese were essentially the border militias, the ones that were already on the border at the moment of the Chinese invasion, and so they were basically left to fight out heroically until they were captured, and then the Chinese destroyed all the infrastructure along that border. That was also a big hit for the Vietnamese because during the Second Indochina War. The Americans had bombed so much Vietnamese infrastructure south of that border. So really, most Chinese aid that built up infrastructure that survived the American bombing was along that border in terms of industrial potential, in terms of factories, mines, all of that. And that's also a very heavily an area with a lot of natural resources for Vietnam. So the destruction of those mines and dams and all that stuff, that was pretty significant in terms of the economic damage. But yeah, the Chinese withdrew within a month and they could claim victory. There's one other point in terms of war aims. So the Chinese claim victory, the Vietnamese claim victory in defending their homeland, and so on. Both can claim victory. But the Chinese also achieved one other thing for Deng Xiaoping, which is that when he, and this is Jiang Xiaoming's greatest contribution, I think, in his book. So he talks about these meetings where Deng basically told his military staff to plan for the invasion of Vietnam. And a couple of his marshals just simply stood up and said, look, this is a socialist brother. We've been helping them for all these years. They're not bad people. We shouldn't be doing this. And you know, they're out, right? He was able to see exactly, you know, who were the people that he could trust, who were the people that he couldn't trust, and he managed. Because if you remember, Deng was not yet he was something called paramount leader, but that's not a real post, right? He was vice premier. That's basically what he was. He wasn't even premier. He had gathered a lot of power for himself, but he hadn't consolidated it in 1978, 79. What the war allowed him to do domestically was
because that's really interesting. I mean, that's like what the war, what it enables, you know, what the circumstances of a war as like such a crisis or a period of exception, like what it allows like a very skillful operator to achieve. Shifting gears to another piece of that like war, something that you and I had talked about in a previous conversation that stuck with me, and that I've been dying to ask you about since, is the degree to which, you know, sort of what happened when the Vietnamese came into the country. Because something that we have not talked about at all, and you know, in this pretty long conversation, is the fact that like the Khmer Rouge, like the character of the regime was, you know, not just secretive and purge heavy and all that. It was also just like structured around brutality. Their radical vision of, you know, an isolated, self-sustaining government meant essentially that they had to empty an overstuffed capital city and make everybody farm rice. And while parts of that weren't really that bad of an idea considering like the ravages of the previous war, a lot of the idea was very bad, and a lot of the execution was, there was a reason people compared it to the Nazi Holocaust and so on, even if there are important differences. When the Vietnamese invaded, they didn't, it was not like, as you've described to me, like there wasn't, they didn't go in on like this, humanitarian mission, but what they encountered and sort of what they understood as, what their role as an occupying power would be in a post-Khmer Rouge world. Could you explain a little bit about like, well, what was it that they saw? Like, what was the aftermath that they were witnessing? And sort of before we get to the question, I guess, of, like actually managing the people, and sort of questions of aid and refugees, but specifically on just sort of dealing up with the aftermath of, things like discovering Tuol Sleng, and other sort of sites of Khmer Rouge atrocity.
Yeah, so the first thing about it is to note that the Vietnamese maintained an embassy in Phnom Penh. The Vietnamese and the Chinese, there were very, very few countries that were allowed to maintain an embassy in Phnom Penh after April 1975. I mean, the city is emptied out, right? It's eerie, right? It's like, it's hard to get supplies, but a Vietnamese embassy and a Chinese embassy and just a very few couple other embassies were allowed to remain in Phnom Penh of these so-called, Vietnam was officially a friendly power to the Khmer Rouge until December 1977 when they made that public break with each other. They were in fact fighting for about 6 months, or 8 months actually, before they were declared enemies. So throughout this time, the Vietnamese embassy and its staff, and of course some of its staff are normal embassy staff and some of its staff are intelligence staff, have a certain idea of what was happening in Phnom Penh, and then a less clear idea about what was happening beyond Phnom Penh. So it's not a total shock to them. They understood at the end of 1977 that they had these working groups that had been trying to figure out what to do with the problem in Cambodia. And one of the very key, interesting documents that I found is that they actually talked about the need to liberate Cambodia from these murderers and these people, and they believed that if Vietnam were to do so, it would be humanitarian, it would be just, and the world would be in support. That essentially they would get thanked from the rest of the world. Now that obviously didn't happen, but they did to some extent believe it. So when in 1978, Phan Hien, the deputy foreign minister, made this big round of the Southeast Asian countries to normalize relations with them, they essentially were sounding them out on some of their views on Cambodia and things like that. And he came back essentially with this idea that everybody hates the Khmer Rouge. So in theory, everyone would be very happy if they were gone. And I think the first part of it is true. Everyone hates the Khmer Rouge. The second part.
Oh no, it's I found this handbill that I sent to Brendan today. I guess it's titled "Vietnam Out of Kampuchea," and it's from San Francisco. I guess it's from '78. The flagrant act of aggression is part of the Vietnamese drive to annex Kampuchea and Laos and form an Indochina Federation under their complete domination. Assemble at UN Plaza in San Francisco and then march to TASS news agency, which for listeners was the Soviet news agency. The Bay Area Coalition to support democratic Kampuchea. Yeah,
so there were, the funny thing is, in a lot of these ultra-liberal circles or ultra-left circles in not just the United States, but France, Sweden, places like that. So, for example, Noam Chomsky, he had written this book about manufactured consent, and his immediate reaction first to the reports of Khmer Rouge atrocities was that, hey, is this like, I mean, he's been sort of dragged through the mud for it, as being like genocide denial. I think a more charitable reading was that he was saying you should be critical in looking at these reports, right? So the United States government has lied in the past. Is it possible that they're lying again? And I think that sums up essentially the international situation when it came to Cambodia, was that there had been so many lies in the past about communist government and what was happening, that people had lost faith in their governments, and they now kind of overcorrect, right? They find it difficult to believe when actual evidence does emerge of very, very serious atrocities.
Well, and in this case, when the Vietnamese are on the ground, and what is it that they're seeing, and how does it adjust the conduct of what they're doing in the country? Like, if it takes them 3 weeks to Phnom Penh, they set up a government that is functionally a subordinate government to Hanoi for the period, until for well into the 80s. But what is like how they pretty quickly, like, it doesn't take that long before they start talking about like, I think I don't are they the first ones to call it genocide?
They definitely use the word genocide. They don't use it enough, actually. They mainly blame it on the Chinese, right? In a way, it's also a chauvinistic way of thinking about Cambodia, in the sense that the Vietnamese didn't really think of the Cambodians as being, well, because so going back to the way that the Vietnamese reason about these things, everything, in the Marxist world, right, everything is rational, right? So every action, diplomatic, historical, political, has to be based on some sort of material reality, material condition, right? And the Vietnamese, when they look at the Khmer Rouge attacking them, they were just really surprised. Like, they couldn't make sense of it, because they were like, why would they do that? Because they're a much weaker country, right? So the only reason that they would do that is if the Chinese told them to do that. The Chinese were supporting the Khmer Rouge materially, but they were not telling them to attack Vietnam. They didn't need to. The Khmer Rouge had plenty of reasons of their own to attack Vietnam that were not rational. But the Vietnamese had a lot of problems sort of thinking about that. So they really were not granting the Khmer Rouge leaders even. I mean, they did a quick trial, in absentia, and accused them of genocide, crimes against humanities, all that stuff. But just the top 3 leaders, and yeah, they just didn't. They didn't have the time or money or effort in terms of publicity to make this issue bigger, in part because they were maybe a bit too preoccupied with China, with blaming China for everything that happened. And I think that was their biggest diplomatic mistake. Now, in terms of what they actually saw on the ground, I mean, they saw a nation on its knees, right? They saw a nation that's lost between a quarter and a third of its population. Everybody was displaced, essentially. And an economy that had totally collapsed. Basically, rice. They looked for rice store, grain stores, and they found nothing. And the invasion happened. This is something people also forget. Was that late 1978, early 1979? The whole region, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, were hit by massive, massive floods. This is actually like a really, really bad year in terms of meteorologically.
Well, and that also leads to the kind of next, sort of one of the bigger issues that comes out of this war, which is the refugee and sort of like, starvation crisis that gets kind of mixed up with the Khmer Rouge's, bad agricultural policies that produced mass starvation in its own right.
Right. So the Khmer Rouge would later call to the defense. They would say, well, it's just bad weather. It's just like bad luck. Our policies were good, but
no, it was actually like, it was just bad luck that we had like teams of 5-year-olds digging ditches. It was just bad luck.
Yeah. So I mean, that's sort of the defense in court, right? It makes no sense but the point is that it was a bad meteorological situation that was exacerbated massively by these policies. And so the number one priority as the Vietnamese came in was just how to head off a massive famine, right? Like how to just avoid having millions of people die on our watch, because it was the Vietnamese responsibility now.
Well, so when some people, some scholars like Evans and Rowley, whom we cite in our show, they say that America and the West were pretty loath to give Vietnam's occupying government like any aid to deal with the situation.
Absolutely.
And then others like, William Shawcross, who has since gone to the political right, but whose book Sideshow about Cambodia is very good. He lays the blame on Hanoi. And that was sort of the world, not like, I mean, we'll get to this, like, I guess, because like the world consensus was, because the U.S. was critical of Vietnam and invading Cambodia. China was critical of the U.S. It was really just, Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc behind Vietnam. Like Shawcross then he said it was Vietnam's fault or whatever, that they were holding up aid, for various reasons. What was the reality?
The reality is extremely, extremely complicated. Most of the aid that did come through, in terms of just grain, in terms of just, straight up like stuff that went into people's stomachs to prevent them from dying, that came straight from Vietnamese grain stocks. Vietnamese basically decimated their own grain stocks, opened up all the storehouses and shipped everything possible to Cambodia. At the same time, they were begging the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and these countries sent also massive grain shipments down just to head off disaster. In terms of Western aid, it's extremely complicated. So first of all, a lot of countries a lot of Western countries, so that includes Japan, Australia, Europe, had opened up trade and aid to Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia after 1973, after the signing of the Paris Peace Treaty. And Vietnam and Laos readily took that up. The Khmer Rouge said no, thank you. It was self-sufficient, so on. Right? But it was available. The United States, at the conclusion of not only did it not lift the embargo, but at the conclusion of the Second Indochina War, extended the embargo to South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. What was called Category Z export restrictions. And these are very, very stringent. Essentially, no aid, no trade whatsoever. And they do allow for some humanitarian aid, but the provisions for it are Byzantine. So I like this example that's often given, which is so a lot of people in these conflicts had lost limbs, right, through like bombings and stepping on mines and things like that. So the U.S. Humanitarian aid that's allowed, and mostly it's not humanitarian aid by the U.S. government. It's humanitarian aid that's allowed by private citizens and churches and these sorts of things. So like today, how people are raising funds for Gaza, that sort of thing, right? So the U.S. was restricting their ability for private individuals and organizations to even raise money and give their own money to these places.
Right, and also, as we talk about in the show, some of the aid organizations that were really essential in administering whatever U.S. aid was there, like World Vision, were just widely reported to be working hand in glove with the CIA.
Right.
And there was already, which is not to say that like all the aid was just disappearing because it was going into like the CIA's black book ops or whatever. No. It's that like instead just to say that like the organizations were not trusted, and if they're doing intelligence work with the CIA, then they're probably not really focused on maximizing aid dispersal responsibly.
Well, so there were all these restrictions, right, and questions on U.S. aid, but so that example is talking about with the humanitarian aid is you can send in. So according to the provisions, you can send in already made prosthetic limbs. You cannot send in a machine that makes a prosthetic limb, because that would be considered a capital good because it's a machine.
As opposed to like an end user, like a product for the end user or whatever.
Now, I can't really see. I guess you probably don't are not missing limbs. I'm luckily not either. But if anybody's ever had to deal with prosthetic limbs, they'll know that it's very useless if somebody ships you a already made prosthetic limb.
Yeah,
that
makes
insane. No sense because every human is different. It has to be custom made.
So essentially, essentially, what you're saying is that like the U.S. had put these really intense restrictions and had in place very severe restrictions in place against Vietnam, and at this precise moment when Vietnam was the occupying government and just was the conduit through which, meaning that even if you were sending aid to Cambodia, just that like you were dealing with the Vietnamese. Just at the moment when that was the crisis, like it was, the sort of West was both like unwilling and unprepared for.
Well, so the U.S. was unwilling. The other countries were still willing. Some countries cut off aid on their own accord. So like the ones that are close to the U.S., like UK, and so on. But some countries that wanted to continue aid, like Australia, were bullied by the United States into cutting that aid. Essentially, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos were blacklisted, right? And if you traded or aided them, the U.S. makes sure that you would incur the wrath and potentially sanctions from the United States. So there were all these restrictions. And then, of course, all of that aid, like you say, get filtered through the Vietnamese. But these allegations of distribution, so I have some like more detailed documents from Oxfam and some other NGOs that deal with some specific cases of how things were distributed. Many of these NGOs were actually fairly happy with how the Vietnamese distributed aid, and a lot of the criticism came from actually the refugee camps on the Thai border, and these refugee camps were, of course, controlled by the Khmer Rouge.
This gets to kind of the next sort of the next question, which is about how like this next phase, because basically like a new phase kind of is beginning in the regional politics, because at the same time the Khmer Rouge is out of power and they're they're reviled, they're not internationally popular. However, the U.S. does support them in different ways diplomatically. They don't recognize the government that Vietnam sets up Cambodia, instead choosing to recognize the government of the Khmer Rouge. There is, in addition to this sort of starvation crisis, there is also a refugee crisis that is complicated because of the nature of why people are it was very contentious in the press at the time how it was described. What was the nature of like the refugee, these refugee camps in the Thai border? How did the Khmer Rouge, figure in to, their development as an issue? And, I guess sort of that kind of leads naturally to the question of like, well, what the heck is the Khmer Rouge doing around, and why is the U.S. sticking up for him?
Yeah, so basically the Khmer Rouge had withdrawn to this western part of the country, and most Cambodians have to make a decision. Right? They had to make the decision whether to try to return to the places where they had been forcibly removed during the period 75 to 79, or are they going to try to just run away from the country, which has been under conflict now for 35 or almost 40 years altogether. And in order to do that, the best route out was, you could try to take the chances in the South China Sea, and some people did, but the best land route is to just try to run to Thailand, and from there to through UN refugee camps to get admission and sponsorship, sometimes through church organizations, sometimes through philanthropic or like through family or whatever connections, to try to get to Western countries, France, United States. And many of them that choose to leave the country, they have to go through these camps on the Cambodian-Thai border that were controlled by the Khmer Rouge. I mean, there were other forces present. There was the Funsipek, the royalist force of Sihanouk. There was this very small so-called Democratic Western force of Son Sen. They were insignificant militarily, politically, and administratively, because the Khmer Rouge had really complete control of these camps, and later on of the coalition government of Democratic Kampuchea, which was formed 1982 in Singapore. The Khmer Rouge, as we know fairly well, do not like to give up any morsel of control. They like to have full control of any organization that they have. So essentially, a lot of the criticism that came earlier about Vietnamese distribution of aid was in this way. So if international aid was to go through Vietnamese-controlled ports into Cambodia, the Vietnamese have to make sure that they're told to make sure that a proportional amount of it, and sometimes a disproportional amount of it, actually most times disproportional amount of it, reach the refugee camps or reach the sort of areas that are actually controlled by the Khmer Rouge. And I mean, again, there are all sorts of reports this way and that way. I think the Vietnamese, under the circumstances, allowed a fairly great amount of aid to reach these places, and essentially to not punish the populations and to keep the fighting with the Khmer Rouge more or less at the military front, not the home front. And also the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia more generally was one in which the Vietnamese didn't requisition local food, requisition local materials from the local population, that the army men, the soldiers were told very strict instructions to take nothing from local populations, to treat people with respect. And so, there was very little of civilian casualty from direct occupation and fighting. There were lots of civilian casualties from mines and from things like that. Right.
Well, and one thing, is sort of that becomes like strange in this period is that, and lasts for years, is that the U.S. backs the out of power Khmer Rouge. Geopolitically, it's pretty obvious, just as a counter to its by then traditional rival, Vietnam. And what is the character of this support? The Khmer Rouge are, at the same time as this is going on, like there is like an increasing sense, it's slow to develop, and it's not really until the 1990s that it becomes, I think, more globally known, or at least with the kind of associations that it has now. But like, it was known that the Khmer Rouge had, people accused them pretty, in the Western press and in government, the word genocide was not far from describing them in many circumstances then, and yet the U.S. supported them. What was the basis for that, and what was the nature of it?
Well, Jimmy Carter, so one of the reasons the Vietnamese thought that they would be thanked was because it seemed that the crimes of the Khmer Rouge were already fairly well known in the Western press. And Jimmy Carter had said, I think in 76 or 77, that there's no bigger violator of human rights in the world today than the Khmer Rouge government. Right? So very public statements. The United States never walked back from these statements. The official position was that they were not aiding or supporting the Khmer Rouge in any way. The official position is they're supporting something called the coalition government of Democratic Kampuchea, which was formed in 1982 in Singapore, but before that they would say they were supporting the refugees and the democratic forces of Son Sen as part of this coalition government. So because Sihanouk remained, the sort of titular, the figurehead leader of this coalition government, this fiction was digestible for certain members of American Congress and American public, that in fact we were not supporting the Khmer Rouge, who are terrible, but we were supporting these very cool democratic people.
It's new Coke. It's totally different. I mean, it is interesting because you then, eventually though, like the Vietnamese want to leave. Like they don't want to be there, and the occupation is very costly for them, especially because they're in pretty dire economic straits for much of the 1980s. And they implement their own major, major economic reforms in 1986. And there's sort of then, the kind of arc of the period is sort of this buildup toward what was then the most expensive elections in UN history, which take place in, is it 92?
Sorry, what are you talking about?
The UN elections.
Oh yeah, in Cambodia. That's 1993. Yeah.
Three. The UN election leads up to the UN elections in 1993, and there is this kind of this process that I think of as like there is some measure of guerrilla conflict, but there is also this sort of very active attempt to fashion something like a non-Vietnamese sort of like controlled like political system. What is the sort of like process by which it kind of, develops toward this UN election? And then, what is sort of, the UN election? I know it was held up as both as a triumph, but it had some very substantial flaws that were evident at the time.
Yeah. So we're skipping a number of years here, and I think we probably should, given the time, to try to summarize the whole process leading up to that. Around 1987, I think this will be relevant to a number of our listeners who have been following current events. There was, as I was saying earlier, the key really to breaking this fiction of the coalition government of Democratic Kampuchea as being anything but a Khmer Rouge-controlled organization was really in driving a wedge between Sihanouk, right, who was actually very, very important as a symbolic leader, and the Khmer Rouge, and start to break up that whole coalition altogether. Sihanouk is a very strange person. He's still a great mystery to me, and I think to many biographers of him. Probably the best one I can recommend is Milton Osborne's Prince of Light, Prince of Darkness. Really great book about this truly mysterious person. He had lost about half of his family, directly killed, executed by the Khmer Rouge, yet he continued to work with them this whole time, believing that they were the last best chance for the survival of Cambodia before it's wiped out completely by the Vietnamese. Sihanouk and his forces are routinely killed by the Khmer Rouge, like weeded out, these purges. It's just part of the Khmer Rouge political process. It's, like Monday, right? So, it's not that strange. And every time that happens, he would sulk, and he would just fly off, sometimes to Beijing, but oftentimes to visit his good friend Kim Il-sung in Pyongyang. And Kim, he's a prince that gave up the crown to be a prime minister, but he's still a prince, right? Like he likes his women, and he likes his fun, and he likes his. He gave this great interview in Playboy about the whole thing, which you can read. But he likes his luxuries, and Kim Il Sung knows that, and he gives him a nice palace in Pyongyang to cool off when this happens. It happens more than once. And one of these times, actually, he met up with his good friend, who's actually the Palestinian Liberation Organization's representative to Pyongyang. His name is Mustafa al-Safarini, who later became representative to Cambodia years later. But he'd been friends with Sihanouk for a long time in the non-aligned movement, and they had dinner, and essentially Sihanouk had asked him to pass a message to the Vietnamese saying he'd like to meet, saying he actually finally got sick of the Khmer Rouge. And this was, in Pyongyang, with the Palestinians, North Koreans interceding. This was really the first time that the two sides started to get in touch. I mean, the meeting didn't pan out immediately, but the Vietnamese got the message. They understood that this was the way forward. So within the next year, a year and a half, through a series of meetings that were then facilitated eventually by the Indonesians for the Jakarta informal meetings, and then through further formal rounds of negotiations in Paris, the sides finally managed to arrive at a solution. Essentially, the Vietnamese gave up quite a lot. They were willing to withdraw unilaterally in 1989, ahead of a political resolution in 1991. But essentially, what it allowed for was the UN Transitional Authority of Cambodia, UNTAC, between 91 and 93, with Sihanouk acting as the titular head. And what would happen at the end is all the factions. So during the Transitional Authority, the factions would divide power about half-half, and then Sihanouk holds the sort of final trump card. He's the president, so he does the tiebreaker. And how the Vietnamese were finally willing to agree to this was really their conviction in the end that, okay, Sihanouk can be distinguishable from the Khmer Rouge. He is separate. And what happened? The big thing that they had to give up was they really wanted an insertion into the Cambodian constitution and into the Paris peace agreement, that Cambodia will refrain from genocidal activities or behavior as in the recent past. Not even mentioning who conducted this behavior, but just like it's a way of phrasing never again, right? That's what we said at the end of World War II, right? Never again. So they really wanted this never again clause in the Paris Peace Agreement. That didn't pan out. They also, part of the never again clause is also they really wanted the Khmer Rouge to not be able to stand for election. And that also didn't pan out. The Khmer Rouge were allowed to come back and just stand for elections as any other group. I mean, imagine, after Treblinka and all the concentration camps.
And what ends up happening? What is the government that sort of emerges from this? And as sort of a consequence of this, like how do the elections work? And then what is the government that comes from it? Like how does it reconcile, like these pretty glaring contradictions?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, complicated, but essentially, the royalists actually won the most votes, not by like a huge long shot, but the second coming in were the pro-Vietnam government of Hun Sen, and Hun Sen essentially refused to acknowledge defeat, and he wanted a co-prime minister situation, which Hun Sen at this time actually were willing to entertain, because they just wanted an end to conflict and infighting, and they wanted to move the country forward. And so essentially they worked out a sort of power sharing agreement, which in the end, because of Hun Sen's existing power networks and machinations and dark arts, if you will, he managed to turn to his favor in the coming years. But they want to know that the Khmer Rouge were absolutely, the good news, they were absolutely defeated in the elections. And of course they refused to accept the results. So they go back to what they know best, what they're happiest doing, which is guerrilla fighting in the jungle. And in fact, the thing that the Vietnamese had warned about, which is that if they ever withdraw, the Khmer Rouge will come back in great force. It did pan out again in the end in the 90s. So if you go today to some of the the final layers of the Khmer Rouge, as they call them, in northwest Cambodia, around the Siem Reap area, around Persat and all these sort of western areas, many of these areas actually the Khmer Rouge did not control in the 1980s at all. They actually expanded their territories after 1993. That's the irony. The Civil War continues until 1999. And it continues because until 1998, Pol Pot finally died. So none of the Khmer Rouge leaders, least of all Pol Pot, but even the other ones that went to trial in 2013 up to 2018-19, none of them ever recanted, ever repented, ever expressed remorse for what they did. Right? They very much believed that they were a bit unlucky, but basically everything they did was correct. And so the Civil War continued. The difference this time was that, and as you said earlier, the Vietnamese wanted to withdraw much earlier. They in fact, 1982, they were trying to work out a way that they could withdraw from the country because of all these issues. But the Cambodian government, under eventually Prime Minister Hun Sen, earlier Prince Savan, basically just kept begging them to remain as much as possible, because they believed that they would be completely wiped out by the Khmer Rouge, that genocide will return. And the Vietnamese, there was a brief point where the General Secretary even toyed with the idea of working with the Khmer Rouge to build a coalition government that was anti-West, anti-capitalist, but that was quickly rejected. I'm going into too many details, but essentially what because there's a lot of details, but essentially what happens in the 90s was the Civil War restarted, and it delayed, in fact, Cambodia's entry into ASEAN. Cambodia was supposed to enter ASEAN the same year as Laos and Myanmar, which is 1997, and in fact it was delayed until 1999.
Right.
So 98, Pol Pot died, and Hun Sen finally, the way that he resolved it was by giving this promise, something he called the win-win solution, which is that it's more than an amnesty. It's more than an amnesty. Essentially what he says is, if any Khmer Rouge commanders or units defect, they are promised not just full amnesty for everything they did before, including atrocities, right? No investigation into that, but also the same rank in the Cambodian military and government as they had held in the Khmer Rouge military and government. Right? And this was really what ended the war, what turned the tide around, coupled with the death of Pol Pot. And so today, when we talk about why the extraordinary chambers of Cambodia have not prosecuted more people beyond the very top group of Khmer Rouge leaders, and why Hun Sen wanted to essentially circumscribe the power of the court to just that top group, is because as you go down the pyramid, that's going to be a lot more people, and many of them are still holding top posts, or their children are holding top posts in Cambodian government military today. And that was the sort of deal with the devil that he had to make in the end in order to bring peace.
Well, and it's interesting because now, sort of, if you skip, let's say 25 years or so to roughly the present, Hun Sen's son has assumed, is in the process of, he is now in title the leader of Cambodia, but it's sort of still clear that his father is involved. And when we were in Cambodia, the people we talked to, the common perception is that that's the sort of everyday perception. And at the same time, Cambodia and Vietnam are very economically integrated. Phnom Penh has seen an extreme infusion of Chinese capital in the last 15 years. Ho Chi Minh City is growing really, really quickly as well. And there's the conflicts that we've, just spent all this time talking about, they seem very, very far in the past, particularly in the sense of the geopolitical tension. which sort of leads me to wonder, well, what is the ultimate legacy of the war then? Sort of beginning with the Third Indochina War conflict, which is this three-way conflict between Vietnam and at first the Khmer Rouge-led, Cambodia, which then becomes kind of it's a sort of perpetual enemy, and then China, and now all of these companies, including the U.S., which is a previous unstated party in the conflict in many ways, they're all now, fabulous trading partners, and have interconnected elites and so forth and so on. And obviously with China and the U.S., that's changing a bit. But what is the legacy of this war then? Like, is it felt then? Is there still are there problems that were produced by it that have persisted? We talked about war as like a kind of period of exception. Were there some like really critical decisions about the future that were made as a result of this conflict?
Yeah, so I think the biggest consequence of the conflict to the world, in the broadest view, is really the entrenchment of this principle of non-interference in Southeast Asian politics. In particular in this organization, ASEAN. So ASEAN, before this conflict, was really a very weak organization that met, it was created in 1967, but it met very irregularly. It didn't have a secretariat. It didn't have really any funding. The leaders met every 2-3 years, but it hadn't signed any significant treaties other than the founding treaty, and then sort of some declarations on zone of freedom, peace, and so on, and the Treaty of Amity Cooperation, but no sort of specific economic treaties, no specific institutions. But ASEAN since then, today, what ASEAN is a sort of thriving organization from the external perspective, right? Looking from outside, it looks like it's thriving. It looks like the second most integrated region in the world after the EU. It looks like economically there's so many treaties, agreements. Each year ASEAN hosts something like 600 meetings, right? So like average, more than like almost two meetings a day. And many of these meetings are huge. Many of these fora, like East Asia Regional Forum, the Shangri-La Dialogues, or like the East Asia Forum, the ASEAN Regional Forum, that's for security, right? So all these places where the biggest powers in the Asia Pacific, so that includes Russia, China, United States, right? India, Japan, right? So when the leaders of these major nations meet with each other each year, oftentimes it's on ASEAN turf. It's in fora that's organized by ASEAN. And ASEAN is these 10, Indonesia's relatively a bit larger, but the rest of them, and Indonesia itself too, right? Militarily not very powerful, economically not like, these are not superpowers or even great powers in any way, but they have managed to centralize themselves in Asia Pacific affairs. So it's a major change. And this inflection point is the Third Indochina War. So it's really with the Third Indochina War that ASEAN found its footing, Singapore acting as the meeting place that created the coalition government, Democratic Kampuchea, ASEAN opposition to the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia being sort of the linchpin for the non-aligned movement and for the UN, around which diplomatic support was marshaled for the Khmer Rouge-led CGDK coalition. So ASEAN, they're very proud of this, actually. In the histories, if you talk to officials today, they're very proud of having stood up to the Vietnamese. They're very proud of their role, essentially, in preventing what they call a fait accompli and to stand up for the principle of non-interference. Right? So, and the Vietnamese, to a large extent, actually lost the war. I mean, they won in the sense that they occupied Phnom Penh and whatever, but in the sense they also lost, because at the end of the day, they unilaterally withdrew and they became an ASEAN member and they signed up to all these same principles. They fully accept these principles now, non-interference. So this definition of sovereignty that's extreme, that's very extreme, right? That says essentially that the state has the monopoly of the use of legal force within a territory. So essentially, there is no threshold of what the state does within its territory that would warrant international intervention or warring. And that has come back to bite ASEAN several times. In 1999, with the crisis over East Timor, and more recently, 2016-17, with the Rohingya crisis, which gave way eventually to the military coup in Myanmar. And in none of these cases have the ASEAN members been able to do anything remotely useful, because of this entrenched principle interference. So really what the Third Indochina War is for me is it basically said that here's the bar that's been set, yeah? The Khmer Rouge is the bar. So if the killing of 1 to 2 million people is insufficient evidence and insufficient reason for some sort of regional intervention to stop that, then what is a few 100,000 Rohingya, right? What is a few tens of thousands of East Timorese, right? Like, if the bar is set that low, or that high, I guess. I don't know how we talk about bars, but essentially,
it poses the question of just what then is acceptable for anybody to do anything until it's already happened, essentially.
Well, it is acceptable, and also there's nothing you could do about it. Right?
Yes, yes.
So no suspension of membership for Myanmar, no formal suspension. They were not allowed to come to the meetings for 1 or 2 cycles. They were technically allowed as long as they brought a member of the Democratic rebellion as well, but of course they won't be to do that. But now they're fully participating in all the meetings again. So there are no economic sanctions, no membership suspensions, no political sanctions whatsoever. So this I think is the biggest legacy of the Third Indochina War, actually, for the region. And of course, for Cambodia more specifically, of course, there are more specific legacies as well. It entrenched the power of the Hun Sen family, and of course, domestic Cambodian politics is even more complicated. Hun Sen actually won a lot of that power later on in the 90s as well. It was more of a balance of power among several different families before that, and Hun Sen's not the only one who's passed on his position to his son. Thi Bang and others have passed on their own positions as well. So it's just a complicated situation in Cambodia, but the Cambodia today remains, I think, as in the past. Cambodia says that it is for sale, essentially, right? It is for sale to the highest bidder, and it's not a problem of the Chinese investing too much. It's the problem of you other guys not investing enough.
It's the kind of image, like Tom Friedman style example of kind of what it's like when you go there is, we were in a tuk-tuk one day and we were going back from some place in the outskirts of the city into the city center, and we went past a mall that had clearly been built somewhat recently, and it didn't look, it wasn't filled in yet. And right next to it was a Starbucks drive-through. There is it's anybody who is saying oh, it's Chinese capital, you're lying. That's just not, the issue is quite clearly that there is a bunch of money coming in to satisfy things that can make money, which in the case of Chinese capital, it seems from what we saw, was a lot of casinos and a lot of, leisure tourism. I mean, in Vietnam, there are no casinos. So when you're in the Cambodian cities close to the border, you see casinos that are specifically about catering to Vietnamese tourists. Like, it's kind of classically uneven development. And that's like, that's not been resolved in Cambodia. I mean, like, things are, it's, I think it's an amazing place, but it's extraordinary. We talked to one person, a villager in a place that had, seen some really bad fighting over decades. And this guy, he said, that the biggest difference between, like the end of the Khmer Rouge period and now was that then only one person in the family had to work to support a family, whereas now everybody has to work. And that everybody, he didn't specify, but like, I imagine that it's not, it's a lot like he means everybody.
Not just the adults.
Exactly. And so, which was pretty, jarring. But I should say we should probably end it here because this has gone very long, but it's because, it was an amazing conversation.
So thank you for the conversation. Yeah, I also need to walk the baby out to the park.
Yeah.
It's the perfect time.
Okay, good. No, I'm glad he was also able to participate in the conversation.
Yeah, he had ideas.